Good evening, and thanks very much for having me, Space Association of Australia. I am really excited to be here and really happy to be, I suppose, talking on this particular topic. I think it's topical because it's really quite new that obviously we have a space agency finally, so the idea of actually beginning to actually push this kind of a notion is at least potentially a good time to start, I guess, as far as us having an agency. So why am I here? I've been a science teacher for 10 years. Before that, I actually, once upon a time, joined the Air Force and went down to the Defence Force Academy. So my interest in aviation has been long-standing. I flew solo when I was 16 in a glider, and I just absolutely love flying and anything to do with space. I'm originally born in Melbourne, so coming down to Melbourne was definitely something I really wanted to do, and I've been obviously listening to some of the podcasts and news, so I was really keen to come down and to meet you all. But my background anyway, in terms of my science, I did oceanography when I was at the Defence Force Academy, and I guess what influenced me to do oceanography was the fact that our first astronaut that actually did go into space, which is Dr. Paul Scully Powell, actually did oceanography. And so when I met him and spoke with him and spoke to him about oceanography years later, I was kind of in awe a little bit of that because it actually sort of did influence me going and doing oceanography and then obviously going on and eventually becoming a teacher. So right now I'm doing my Masters in Research at the University of Southern Queensland, and I'm doing exoplanet research, so not so necessarily related to talking about astronauts, but I thought that it would be really great as a teacher to be able to push something that would potentially benefit kids in the future. So giving them the possibility of one day being able to aim for being able to become astronauts would be something that would be a good thing. So look, just briefly today, I'm going to talk about Australia's astronauts that obviously are born in Australia, but that obviously then became American astronauts. I'm going to define what I'm talking about when I mention astronauts. I'm going to just show you a few media reports, and then particularly rather than listening to what I have to say, I actually really want to report to you on the consultation that I've had with Dr. Paul Scully Powell and Dr. Andy Thomas and what they believe. Because ultimately, by talking to people that have actually been into space, I thought it would be a really good starting point to actually get the conversation flowing about whether we should or should not pursue this. I talk about some benefits and why not. I talk about joint science collaboration, and recently Australia has signed memorandum of understanding with a number of agencies, and so I'll be talking briefly about that, and then about what research is being done by the University of Southern Queensland, supporting some NASA missions and so forth. And I'd like to leave a little bit of time actually for questions and for conversation. So I guess what I would really like to see is I would like to see in my lifetime an Australian astronaut that did not actually have to move overseas in order to become an astronaut. And what I'm talking about is having an Australian flag, someone that has been trained in Australia, that is someone that hasn't had to necessarily take up dual citizenship of any other country, that is recognised in a capacity, in an equal capacity as a member of a crew, which could be with other astronauts from Canada or the USA or any other agency that currently has astronauts. So obviously it's a photoshopped picture here, but this is, I guess, the goal is that maybe we'll be interested to see what sort of timeline will be involved between now and eventually when we'll actually get to see something like that. So by astronaut, I'm talking about an orbital trained worker. I'm not referring to space tourists or space participants. I'm talking about people that go through a selection process along the lines of what NASA obviously have. People with a STEM background, science, technology, engineering, maths, often come from piloting or test piloting backgrounds. And I'll actually mention a couple of people that I believe that potentially could potentially be Australian candidates. And with regards to the Australians that have become astronauts, I'll talk about Dr. Andy Thomas and Dr. Paul Scully Powell now. So Dr. Andy Thomas spent 177 days in space, and what was really amazing about that, a lot of that was actually on board the Mir space station. And Dr. Andy Thomas was actually a very, very senior astronaut who actually became, I believe, the deputy of the astronaut corps. And so he's a very inspirational figure, obviously from South Australia, and his involvement was a little bit after Dr. Paul Scully Power, who was involved with the in the 80s versus Andy Thomas being a little bit later in the 90s. But since then, since Andy Thomas and Paul Scully Power have been into space, there haven't really been any Australian astronauts that have been up, for example, on the International Space Station. So I think that the time for thinking about this, as you can see, there's some now media reports that I'll refer to that are sort of relatively recent, talking about the idea of an Australian astronaut. So this one here is from the University of New South Wales newsroom, and here again we can see that the centre, which is at the University of New South Wales, is obviously with regards to really talking about getting kids engaged and excited about space. And the University of New South Wales is obviously really involved with the sort of research around satellites and engineering. But it was quite interesting. A quote that's from Andrew Dempster was this: until now, anyone wanting to become an astronaut had the odds stacked against them. They had to become citizens of another country, like the US, and then work hard to get into a space agency like NASA. And then Andrew suggests that this won't be the case anymore. The first homegrown astronaut may in fact be a short period of time away, so it may only be years away. And that the announcement that Australia will finally create its own space agency has created the door for a long-held dream for many, a homegrown Australian astronaut. And again, this point is reinforced by a number of articles, just really sort of saying that, in order to become an astronaut, you really need to move to the US, that you need to be a US citizen to apply for NASA, and or you really need to come from a country that has agreements. And so this is actually where I'm hoping that a memorandum of understanding could potentially allow us to get an astronaut from Australia involved. And this, of course, is from an Australian Broadcasting Corporation media report. So I guess what I'm showing is that there is a number of media reports now just floating the idea and suggesting that now could be the time to potentially even for kids to maybe think about this as a future career opportunity. Now, this particular individual, Maria Jovanovic, is a remarkable woman. She came third in her US Air Force test pilot school. She's a Royal Australian Air Force pilot, and she has a first-class honours degree. And this is the sort of person that traditionally would have been a perfect candidate for being for becoming an astronaut. So actually has a very, very similar background to the former US Space Shuttle commander Pam Melroy, who I've spoken with. And Maria is very passionately wants to become an astronaut in Australia, but again, can't become an astronaut because she knows that she'd need to move to the US and take up citizenship of another country. And I guess the point is made is that we're often bringing out astronauts to Australia from the United States to talk to our kids. And as a teacher, I would like to think that we could have Australians speaking to Australian school kids and getting them excited and getting kids to realise that it's not just Americans or it's not just Canadians. In fact, Canada's had 12 astronauts, and Canada actually had a similar population to us when they first started planning for an astronaut corps. So Australia has 25 million people now, and so, why? Why not begin to have a conversation similar to perhaps what Canada originally had with regards to establishing something more. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about the emails that I've had back from Dr. Paul Scully Power and Dr. Andy Thomas, and I'll read them out to you because they sort of show two quite different responses to just the idea of whether we should go down this route. So this is from Dr. Paul Scully-Power. So James, the model on establishing an Australian astronaut corps would be Canada. The Canadian Space Agency has an agreement with NASA to provide Canadian astronauts to NASA. With the establishment of the Australian Space Agency, Australia is, for the first time, in a position to do a similar agreement with NASA. That said, it would take government money to support such an initiative, and perhaps your efforts could be directed in that direction. One would have to make the argument as to how it would be in the national interest. This is where Space 2.0 comes in, using space sensors to improve life down here on Earth, whether that be for agriculture, mining, transportation, etc. Keep in mind that STEM is boosted not only by going to space, but in encouraging students in the high-tech space-related fields of smart sensors, algorithms, AI, robotics, etc. Hope that helps. Okay, and so the correspondence that I had from Dr. Annie Thomas is this. So James, thank you for your email. The question of establishing an Australian astronaut corps is politically sensitive. After all, Australia is a country that has only just now established a space agency decades after similar developments in the other OECD countries. And while the concept of astronauts may stimulate STEM activities, it comes at some cost that many find unjustifiable. So establishing an astronaut corps would be a tough sell right now. You may be interested to know that previous Prime Ministers have been asked to consider flying Australians on the shuttle, but the offer had always been declined as it lacked political justification or a compelling reason. I have even tried to promote the idea at the Prime Ministerial level, but without success. I don't see that as having changed. However, change can come in time, but it only comes in small steps. And I suggest a better step would be for Australian research institutions to collaborate in the NASA or European Space Agency human spaceflight programs through joint science collaboration and possibly develop instruments to fly on the International Space Station or the proposed Lunar Gateway. This will open other opportunities down the road, and you never know where they might lead. And with the advent of commercial human flights, there may be opportunities for Australian organisations to purchase seats without committing to the political and economic cost of a national astronaut corps. I would encourage you to pursue that line of reasoning in your talk. Good luck with your presentation, Andrew. So, certainly it's great to hear those two quite differing views from Australia's two astronauts. There is one astronaut that I did seek out correspondence with. I didn't get to go into space. So in 1967, P.K. Chapman was trained as a scientist, as were a number of scientists, to be involved with NASA. But having spoken with Dr. Paul Scully-Power also, I did get a chance to meet him when he was working at 10X Defence. He's a terrific advocate for Australia and very passionate. So how I met Dr. Paul Scully-Power was, prior to working as a teacher, I was working for a company where I got to go and visit 10X Defence in North Sydney. And I spoke with Dr. Paul Scully-Power, and he said this to me about what it was like to go into space. He said, James, the thing about space is you've got to spend at least a week. And the reason I think he said that is because obviously getting used to being in space, the sickness that you experience and so forth. And then he went on to talk about the fact that yes, there will be suborbital flights, and yes, there will be space tourism, but most of that will be just straight up and then straight back down. So it's not really what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about boosting science, boosting life sciences, working with international partners, different agencies, and actively engaging in a science and engineering way up in space and for the good of research. So I guess that's the consultation that I've had with Dr. Paul Scully-Power and Dr. Annie Thomas. The only other consultation that I wish to mention at this point is that I've have spoken with, talking of astronauts, US astronaut Dr. Pam Melroy, and she's been terrific with her time. She spoke to me the other day for around 15 minutes on the phone and said that maybe an opportunity could be raised to potentially get Australia involved with cislunar space, and with potentially something that could happen on the moon. And this is a great one because if you want to talk about mining, Australia loves to talk about mining, and we have certainly a lot of expertise in that, and also being able to remotely control robots and that type of activity would be something that I believe that Australia could certainly find some synergies and get involved in. So again, okay, so the case needs to be built, and as you can see from Dr. Annie Thomas, it's still a difficult time. We certainly need to build a fairly strong case as to get this literally off the ground. So the points that I'm going to make now is how I mean by reverse the brain drain. So, for example, people that I mentioned like Maria Jovanovic, she would like to become an astronaut, but if she does want to become an astronaut with her experience as a test pilot and so forth, then we potentially need to say goodbye to her. She would move to the US and take up US citizenship, and we lose her in terms of as potentially a brilliant person that we lose. But it also could be other people that move to the United States or move to Europe or move to Canada so as to be able to chase this dream and work with agencies that are bigger, that do want to do more than just necessarily have a limited presence. So I again would like to make the point that I think that the reason I'm really passionate about this is because I have spoken to lots of kids from having taught science for the last 10 years, and kids love to talk about space science, and they love to talk about flying, and particularly to do with the International Space Station. And the space station, they've just had STEM on station for last year, and what that was is having science teachers on board and actually delivering science lessons. So if there wasn't a benefit in having science teachers on the space station, then NASA wouldn't have put their money where their mouth was and actually had that initiative happening. And you can just see recently, for example, when there was some discussion around whether NASA should have the education office, and that potentially was going to be something that may have been struck off the budget very quickly, bipartisan support came and kept the education office. So there's a really great synergy between having teaching of science and promoting STEM and having astronauts on the station or elsewhere that can then even come and deliver after they've got back from space and have a really active presence and come and talk to kids. Because you'll notice that the excitement when you are talking to an astronaut, you tend to have a fairly attentive audience. And then when I say by leading our region, so within Asia Pacific region, there's other agencies. I mean, for example, India now looking in 2022 having their own astronauts and launching their own astronauts from their own soil. Obviously, we have China, we have Singapore, and there are other agencies that are working, part of APSRAF, that would be, very keen to see what Australia does, and Australia, could potentially take a sort of more of a leadership role there, and perhaps have some ambition to decide to step forward and say, yep, we're going to have an astronaut, and we're going to have it within a certain period of time. Or at least to consider, whether a feasibility study is warranted. And here, what I am saying is I don't want to take away funding from any other area of our agency. So I'm very much talking about an add-on. I'm very passionate about space science. I love astronomy and astrophysics. So I'm not saying let's take away from one thing and give it to having a human space flight. And I think that in some of the correspondence that I've had on Facebook, I perhaps haven't said that strongly enough. And I really think that it should be something that is an add-on and not something that takes away from any of the other areas, particularly to do with bolstering the life sciences. I mean, recently at the Australian Space Research Conference, it was terrific for me because I actually learned a whole lot about life sciences that I didn't know. For example, when astronauts are coming back from the International Space Station, there's a lot of follow-up studies that are completed of those astronauts. Now, at the moment, they're all in the Northern Hemisphere, so there's no ability to actually directly be involved necessarily looking at the astronauts when they come back unless you're in the Northern Hemisphere. So if we had an astronaut that came back to Australia, then it would potentially boost our research around life sciences. And I think that too often we don't appreciate all the amazing work that is done on the International Space Station. So I think that's probably because when I talk to a kid in the classroom, I say, there's not been a day in your life where someone hasn't actually been in space. And that wasn't the case for most of us in the room. So it's that realization that these kids now are growing up in a time where they've been used to someone being in space, and it's not really a big deal for them. But what would be amazing is that if opportunities come up such as Cislunar and a lunar village and these other things, unless we start to plan for this before it happens, then we will miss the boat. And with having a new agency, we won't necessarily be able to, if we wait 5 to 10 years before we start to even consider and then say something, then we might miss the boat. So it might seem preemptive and even just talking about this, because our agency is fairly limited. We have a limited budget of around $41 million for this first 4 years. The way I see that as being, it's about building the business case over a period of time, and also engaging with the agency and with other people in a really positive manner, and supporting each other. So I do want to make the particular point on our mining expertise and also geology and geophysics, because the head of our agency, Dr. Megan Clark, is a geologist. The first thing I did when I was at the Australian Space Research Conference was I wanted to go and meet her, and I said, "Oh, hi, I did geophysics and I do geology." But the point that I make there is that we have some really fantastic earth scientists, geoscientists, planetary scientists, such as the head of our space agency is a geologist. So if we are to, for example, ever get boots on the ground, then we couldn't have a better person to be pushing earth science and planetary science, and the idea of having an astronaut that is a geoscientist, or someone that is keen to get involved in this kind of way eventually in the future. So I think it's a nice angle to take to actively engage with Dr. Megan Clark and others in the agency and say, well, yes, I know that this is not on Mars, this is an analogue, but the idea is if we want to try and show kids that what will happen during their lifetime, then we need to start sort of thinking about it, I guess, sooner than later. But again, the point is made, joint science collaboration is key, and that's exactly what has been mentioned by the astronauts. It's obviously really important that we don't just build a business case, but we actively encourage cross-collaboration with NASA, with European Space Agency, and obviously Australia's doing some really amazing things with our Deep Space Network, with research that's happening. Rather than going, I don't really have time to go into all the research, but if you do look at the Australian Space Research Conference website, you'll sort of see that there's so much that involves. But the point that I make with the slide here is there are now memoranda of understanding with the European Space Agency. That would be a really excellent one, because Europe will have a lunar village, and that's something that I believe will happen eventually. It'll take a long time, and anyone that's been around says, yeah, it's really brave for you to say will, and that there will be obviously delays will happen to anything. But I'm hopeful, perhaps optimistic, that there will be a return to the moon. With France, Canadian Space Agency, I mentioned there are 12 astronauts. United Kingdom and JAXA and NASA. Now, particularly to do with NASA, as you can see here, this is just very recently at the international of the IOC. So at the Congress that was held recently, you see that there's some high-level meetings which are occurring here with Jim Bridenstine from NASA, obviously meeting our head of our agency, and the memorandum of understanding. So this is a really positive move and can only potentially bring that the possibility of getting an Australian astronaut just that little bit closer. But also talking of NASA collaboration, by no means the only area of NASA collaboration we have, but at the University of Southern Queensland, we're actively doing a follow-up survey of the Transiting Exoplanet Survey satellite and Minerva Australis. So it's terrific that this is a really exciting time in space science, and astronomy obviously traditionally does get access to to some really terrific researchers, and being able to work collaboratively with NASA is something that we're already actively doing. And so this was Professor John T. Horner is one of my supervisors, and it's terrific because talking to him, very keen planetary scientist, and I guess you might think, well, what does the discussion of exoplanets have to do with our solar system? Well, what we're doing is we're trying to understand our solar system, we're trying to understand Mars, and the more that we understand our local planets, then the more that we can understand exoplanets. And vice versa, the more we understand exoplanets, the more that then feeds into planetary science. So I guess in conclusion, I would like to think that, obviously with the Australian Space Stations being in a startup phase, that we could hope for doing more of a feasibility study. And a feasibility study would be a really great thing because it would just mean that we'd bring some people together that could actually start to talk about, what would our options be? How could Australia contribute? What would our Canada arm be? If we were, what is it that Australia can bring to the table when it comes to discussion of International Space Station? I don't know if the International Space Station is going to be up forever. It's probably not. And so, let's try and think. Okay, so when the ISS is no longer up, then what's our opportunity going to be that we can then that we can then contribute? And I'd like to just clarify more the memorandum of understanding and find out what opportunities are available with the Lunar Gateway. So I guess that's a point where I'd welcome any questions. And yeah. Yes, please.
Watching the stream rather here.
Sure.
Still a helper and a science teacher, and I'm with you all right there. And I think Canberra is a very, very good analogy. What is our Canberra? I think what is our Canada? That is the way to think about it. What is our niche? We're so new in having a space agency. We need to be looking for a niche. Just a couple of little points. One, did you know there's a member of staff at RMIT who is an ex-ESA astronaut trainer? She currently works on staff here, Dr. Gail Isles.
Yes, I follow her on Twitter.
Right, okay, so she's a member of staff at RMIT.
Oh, terrific.
So you want to talk about how to train astronauts?
Yeah.
She's the go-to person. The next thing is, Philip Chapman was a fully trained Australian Apollo astronaut, and he was born in Melbourne, but you weren't able to make contact with him. He would have had some very interesting...
but we just lost the video.
Yeah, I have tried multiple times to contact him. I'm still hopeful to chase him down, so to speak. But
he was actually our first, although he never flew.
Yes.
And the next thing is, you talk about geologists. You know what geo means?
Yes, I know it means.
We actually don't have any selenologists or areologists, and our mining technology might not be transferable to a place like the moon, where the material is totally or largely uneroded, incredibly sharp, highly electrically charged, different composition to the Earth. We just can't go around the place blowing things up because we don't know what's going to happen. So maybe we need to have another little bit of a think and have a look about how we go mining the moon just because we're Australian and like digging things up.
Yeah.
It might not work as you think it might. Do I have a question? No, I think it's all really good online. I usually tend to be the contrarian in the room, but this is the way to go. We've got to think of Canada. What is our Canada? So thank you very much.
Thank you. Just a return point there, absolutely. In terms of looking at the lunar surface and the difficulties that obviously astronauts experience with regards to the regolith and the dust and everything, it's a very different atmosphere. However, in terms of being able to utilise I guess our experience, being able to with looking after with resource allocation, so we'd be able to smartly look after robots and so forth in our experience in AI. I thought there could be some synergies there that we could maybe exploit. But yeah, open to suggestions. Definitely.
Andrew, ready.
Andrew?
You talk about inspiring students and things like that. Human spaceflight is incredibly expensive.
Yeah.
Not only, you get one person up there who may come back and can talk to kids and so on. Yes, there's an aspirational aspect to that. But I think you get more bang for your buck if you put kids on a bus or an aeroplane and you take them to a space centre like Woomera or Kennedy Space Centre,
Yep.
Would be a bit more expensive, Space Camp, and that sort of thing. Or you subsidise their visits to the Space Science Education Centre at Strathmore Secondary College, where they can get incredibly inspired and get a bit of a taste and experience. So one person up there, huge amount of money, or you could spend a fraction of that money and give many, many children a first-hand experience.
Andrew, I don't think it needs to be an either-or kind of decision, and that's why I'm particularly saying that it shouldn't be something that where we do take away funds from another area. And I guess the point is made that with the price of launch definitely set to fall, that in the coming years it will be less and less expensive to get people up to space. And I do see a time where there will eventually be a time where we will consider having Australians that potentially could be involved in human spaceflight. So if we choose not to have human spaceflight, and if we decide to save money, for example, then what do we miss out on in terms of people potentially moving overseas? And how do you quantify brain drain? So, for example, for people that are really passionate, they want to be involved in human spaceflight and everything that entails, then really they're going to end up moving overseas. So how do you stop that brain drain? And that, I guess that's my question.
I've got a comment for mine. That argument, Andrew, I get it, but it sort of strikes me as very similar to the why would we send people to move? Why don't we send a satellite or a rover? Because we know what data we need. It's a different thing about human experience of going out there and seeing things, and for an Australian child or student to know that they, as an Australian, can get there. I think it's got a massive amount of inspirational factor, and the inspiration, I think, is quite unmeasurable, really.
I guess the thing is, we have to speak about it in a business sense. So if we agree with the premise that for every dollar we put in, that there is a certain return, then that's going to speak volumes louder. If it can be established, we can build a good business case for it, then it's going to have more clout, I guess. So it's like, how do we quantify what life sciences, what sort of boost we would get in research if we did have Australian astronauts returning to Australian soil? And there are other areas, and especially if we're talking about science, like we're spending $1 billion on the icebreaker. Now, true respect I have towards the Australian Antarctic Division. However, this is a lot of money. And we know that in the future that we are going to be more and more needing to spend money on, potentially getting people into space. And we know that's just a matter of time. So if we agree on that, if we agree that eventually we do need to put people into space, we need to invest more in that, then it certainly would make sense for me to champion increasing the budget of the Australian Space Agency over the coming years, doing it in a bipartisan way, and making sure that we build that budget up eventually to what the Australian Antarctic Division has.
Just got one last question.
Sorry, but you didn't mention at all commercial space and particularly payload specialists, because it sounded like you lumped all astronauts into one basket, and they're very different.
I did in the beginning especially say that we're talking about astronauts in the sense of not being what you're saying with regards to space participants. I'm talking about orbital trained workers, scientists, engineers, and so forth. So I'm talking about specifically trained astronauts in that sense. So I'm sorry if I didn't.
What do you have against, say, somebody either from a commercial background or somebody who has a particular experiment that they actually want to be up on station or
Nothing. I don't have any.
To actually exploit it in person as opposed to look at it remotely. I mean, surely that's a way of sort of leading the way in terms of actually participating in space as opposed to just trying to do it the hard way.
No, I can definitely hear where you're coming from. I think that there's a certain element of people who think, oh, well, isn't it going to happen anyway? Because commercial space flight's going to take off and people can go into space. I'm really particularly talking about research and people that are going to the International Space Station or going to cislunar orbit. I'm not talking about people that are just going up and then coming back down. So I guess, but also in terms of the selection. In terms of selection, do we, for example, as Australian, want to be involved in some sort of selection process, or do we want to just leave it to the market? Do we just want to leave it to, for example, for wealthy people just to buy potentially their way into space? Are we still at the point where we're talking about research in space and that, or do you think that we're past that now?
So you're asking me?
Yeah, so like for example, with the ISS and with astronauts that go to the ISS, how do you think that, like, if Australia was to get involved, I think it'd be great. We could be involved.
I mean, surely there must be astronaut scientists who are actually mission specialists and payload specialists who are going there not because they're astronauts, but because they're scientists.
Well, yeah, but obviously we have a variety of different people that become mission specialists, and they do come from STEM backgrounds. I'm not saying you have to be a pilot in order to become an astronaut. I'm saying that if you have a background, and many of the astronauts do have obviously background as scientists, and they spend time, for example, even in Antarctica and so forth. That's I guess where I'm going, and saying that they would make great astronauts. I'm not really sure your point.
Just one last.
Yep.
Shane Usher from Melbourne University. I was wondering, from a commercial and an international competitive sense, whether what we should be trying to do is to develop some indispensable terrestrial infrastructure that makes the rest of the world want to come to us. And something that comes to mind to me is large-scale vacuum chambers, that are a research facility that will be used for qualification, whether we're talking about technology or astronauts.
Definitely. Ultimately, our ability to convince people that it's a good idea to have astronauts is them seeing that it's actually something that's going to benefit us on Earth. So being able to sort of say, all right, well, we want to be able to understand our planet better, and so by tying that in with things that we're doing in orbit as well as Moon and other locations, we basically always need to make the case that it benefits us on Earth, us understanding our planet better and understanding the atmosphere, that's understanding in orbit. So, thank you.
Thank you. We appreciate that. Thanks very much. And let's put a round of applause for Jeremy.